I am the author of a book called Tuning the Human Biofield, which most of you probably come across. It is based on my master's thesis, which was called Exploring the Effects of Audible Sound on the Human Body and its Biofield. And what's different about the way that I approach sound healing, because that's pretty much what I am, a sound healer and a sound therapist, is that I've tried to understand it from a more scientific and academic perspective than most people. And so what I'm going to be sharing with you today is both the science part of it, but also the sort of shamanistic or esoteric part of it. You know, we really have a peculiar divide in our culture at the moment. And it's, you know, the people who are science-minded, who are left-brained, who are looking for science to verify things, and then people who are more esoteric or feeling or sense-based. And, you know, we've got alternative medicine and conventional medicine. We've got science and spirituality. What I've really come to find is that a lot of that is language. And that ultimately, you know, this is really just a construct that doesn't even really exist. It doesn't. You know, it's all phenomena. You know, it's all an attempt to describe perceived phenomena. We use different words and different concepts, but ultimately we're really pointing at the same things. So one of the things that I really seek to do when I'm describing the things that I'm going to describe to you today is to use as much neutral language as possible, and to really seek to, you know, bridge this gap, because it's almost like it's almost like gang, you know, it's like gangs, it's like gang turf. You know, people tend to fall in one camp or the other, and it's an artificial division, it's an unnecessary division, and it can be healed by just explaining it the right way. You know, people get all bent like, what's the energy in energy medicine? Well, it's electromagnetism. You know, it's not, this is not a big deal. So, so we're going to be talking about how to frame this in a way that people understand it and ultimately they agree with it. I mean, basically what I share about all of this is people say this makes sense to look at life from this perspective. So, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, BioField Tuning is a sound therapy method. It uses tuning forks. I've been developing it over the last 21 years. I started doing massage therapy, and very shortly after becoming certified to do that, I started playing with tuning forks in my massage therapy practice. And what was a hobby for 10 years turned into a vocation somewhat unexpectedly. Because for years when I did this, first of all, I was pretty mortified to tell people that I was using tuning forks to balance people's chakras. Because I'm actually very logical, very practical. I'm always orienting around what makes sense and what's efficient. And there really was something about when you say that you're using tuning forks in the energy field of people that sets off people's what I call woo bells. Like, oh my God, that's so woo-woo, right? I had somebody say to me once, you know, of all the woo-woo stuff that's out there, what you do comes across as the most woo-woo. And I was just mortified. I was like, that is so not what I want to be. And so I really have endeavored to seek to understand and describe what's going on when we wave tuning forks around the body, and what it is exactly that is producing these state changes in people. What's happening on a biological level? What's happening from a physics perspective that coherent sound can produce these very profound outcomes for people? This particular method interacts with the human biofield, which is basically a shortened term of biomagnetic field. And the biofield anatomy hypothesis, which I'm going to talk about in the biofield anatomy map as well. But what it does is it essentially improves the signal-to-noise ratio of your body's electrical system. And it produces predictable and consistent outcomes. So I've trained over 1,000 people at this point, and you know, they're having the same outcomes that I was having in my clinical practice. Raise your hand if you're a practitioner. So, oh, look at all of these. So, And how's it going for you guys? Are you finding that you're getting the same kind of outcomes, right? Yeah. Yep. So it's an incredibly efficient method of healing. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit about how I came across it and how it developed so that you understand kind of where this is coming from. Initially, when I started using tuning forks around the body, I discovered that the tone that an activated tuning fork produced would actually change as I moved it around a body, which was really surprising to me because when I got my first set of tuning forks, it was a C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and it came with a little instruction booklet about this big, and it said, you use the note of C in the root chakra, the note of D in the second chakra, and so on up through to B at the crown. And so I kind of got started in this sort of chakra system, although I did subsequently learn that every place that there claims to be a chakra, there's actually a nerve plexus as well. So it makes sense that there is heightened electrical activity in that particular area because there's a bundle of nerves. So I started off just activating the forks and holding them, sort of passing them, you know, around the area. And I discovered that in certain areas, the tuning fork would actually go loud. In other places, it would go soft. Sometimes it would go full of static. Sometimes it would disappear altogether, or sometimes it would become very sharp, which was really surprising to me because I thought it was going to produce an objective tone, but it didn't. And then I discovered that these areas where there were loud spots, you know, I equated a loud spot with more energy. And I remember thinking that, well, an energy center, you know, along the midline of the body, that's probably where it should be loud. And I made this very curious discovery that I could hook in to a loud spot with the tuning fork and use the tuning fork like a magnet. And then I was able to move it to the center of the body. I called it click, drag, and drop. And I would click on it, drag it to the center, and it would almost feel like it got sucked in to the body. And then suddenly it would be louder over the energy center. And so I did this for 10 years. And I did it really just as a hobby, as a curiosity, maybe 1 to 2 people a week. I started it back when I was in the restaurant business in Connecticut back in 1996. And then I continued it when I moved to Vermont in 2002. In 2004, I started a specialty food business making popcorn, making kettle corn. I had the first organic kettle corn on the market. And it was my plan to blow up that company and sell it to Frito-Lay and to retire. And so that was really what I was on track to do when I made a very interesting discovery that really changed the path of my work. And that was that I was working with a woman one day who had come in and she was complaining that she had a sense of pain, pulling, and discomfort in her jaw and down into her neck and her shoulder. And she had been to a whole slew of different therapists hoping to find relief, and no one had been able to help her. And so when I was working on her, I was holding the tuning fork over the area and, you know, just listening like I did. And then an odd thing happened where there was this very loud noise out my window. And so I walked over to the window to see what was going on and didn't see anything. And I turned around, and for whatever reason, I activated the tuning fork at the window. And so I was walking towards her with the tuning fork activated. I got to be about 2.5 or 3 feet off of her neck, and the sound flared up and it got loud. And as I came through that spot, it got quiet. And I was like, that's really weird. I just found a loud spot, but I found it all the way out here. And so that was very curious. So I went back and I was investigating. Sure enough, it was behaving just like a loud spot close to the body. So I decided that I would click, drag, and drop it back to the throat center, and that's what I did. And it felt very odd to be dragging it along that far, but when I got to the throat and released it, it felt like it dropped in. And so the next day, she called me and she said, Eileen, all of that pain and pulling is gone. And I feel great. And I was like, wow, that's really wild, right? And so the next people who started coming in, I started investigating as far away as I could from their bodies, which was about 6 feet in my treatment room. And I started, out here, let's say the table was there, just moving in slowly towards the body. And the tuning fork produced all kinds of different sounds. And not only that, but I was able to feel areas that felt like there was resistance, like it was like there were walls that I was bumping up against. And so when I started exploring working out in what I now call the biofield, but I didn't really have a word for it back then, my therapeutic outcomes became very dramatic. And people were saying things like, I had pain for 30 years, it's gone in a day. I've had anxiety, it's diminished incredibly. I'm sleeping through the night. All kinds of reports started coming back in that were really dramatic. And I realized that I was onto something. I was like, this is important. This is really, something is happening here. And I felt a little torn, about, because I never wanted to be a healer for a vocation. It just didn't appeal to me at all. I don't even see myself as a healer, quite frankly. I really see myself more as a curious person and a researcher, not so much a healer. So I wasn't really interested in that. But I'd stumbled across something that my inner researcher found incredibly intriguing. And so I was in the process of working on a business plan to take my popcorn business to automation because it had become so busy. This product was flying off the shelves, and it was all I could do to keep up with making it by hand. So I was ready to automate it. And one day, while I was in this process, I had a very interesting experience where in my book, I talk about this concept that I call the mail slot. And it is this idea that I have this sort of mail slot in the back of my head. And every once in a while, that will open and a note will drop in. Guidance, higher self, source, I don't really know where it comes from, which is why I just call it the mail slot. But and usually it's like Post-it notes. But on this particular day, it was like certified mail. Came in very clearly, and it said to me, Eileen, the world needs harmony more than it needs another snack food. And you need to go to college, get degrees, and learn and teach about sound. And I was like, well, I can't really argue with that. The world really does need harmony, right? And this is really cool. And it just so happened that I lived in Johnson, Vermont at the time. And Johnson has Johnson State College, which has an undergraduate degree program in wellness and alternative medicine. And so I was able to take, Community College of Vermont offers a class called Assessment of Prior Learning, where you get college credit for life experience. And I took that. It's a 1 semester, 3-credit course. I got 90 credits for my life experience, and I was able to skip my freshman, sophomore, and junior years of college. Yay. And this was after skipping kindergarten in 4th grade. So I skipped 5 years of school. I'm a big fan of efficiency. And then I was able to do my graduate degree there as well. The Master's in Education program really supported me in pursuing my own track and doing all my independent studies geared towards this research. I did an independent study on plasma. There were a number of things that I did that really supported this, and then I wrote my master's thesis about it. And I really had a world-class team of advisors that really helped me to produce, a really legitimate academic document on this, which was really not easy, because the things that I'm working in, first of all, audible sound is not really, it's very hard to find any kind of research on audible sound. There's been a lot of research done on ultrasound. There's been a lot of research done on infrasound, but not very much on audible sound. I was looking in the beginning, I was looking in things like PubMed and Medline for human energy field and aura, like not finding anything, and being like, what am I doing, trying to put something together that's academic on this topic. But then I read a book called The Energy Healing Experiments by a fellow by the name of Gary Schwartz. And he is a professor at the University of Arizona who'd gotten some NIH grants to study Reiki in 2004. And so in his book, I was introduced to the term BioField. And when I was able to search that, I was able to find, thankfully, that there are researchers out there doing some research on the biofield. People whose work I cited in both my thesis and my book are now friends of mine. And we're actually doing research together, which is really exciting to be involved in this community. It's a small but dedicated group seeking to understand the body's biomagnetic field. There's a lot of reasons why this research isn't being done. One of the things that I did figure out is that in the last 2 decades, who do you think's been doing all the research on sound? Can anybody guess? The military. That's right. That's why there isn't any in PubMed or Medline, because the military has been deeply studying sound and creating all kinds of sonic weaponry, which is unfortunate. They've developed shields, riot gear shields, that emit a frequency that suffocates people. So, you know, with all the good that can be done with sound, certainly I've discovered some amazing things that can be done with sound. Unfortunately, most of the resources around it seem to be being directed towards the bad things you can do with sound too. It is both creative and destructive. So, so the male slot, this idea of guidance coming from somewhere beyond me, really informed my exploration and discovery and sort of charting of what I call the BioField anatomy map. So in the process of exploring this area, you know, about 5 to 6 feet away from people's bodies in towards their bodies, I made some really interesting discoveries. So I would be going along, you know, in the field, and all of a sudden I would hit an area of heavy distortion and resistance. And one of those Post-it notes would drop in, and it would say something like, sadness, age 12. And so I would say to the person, did something really sad happen to you when you were 12? And they would say something like, oh, yeah, that's when my grandmother died. We were really close. You know, I still get sad when I think about it. And so what I started to notice from these little mail drops was a pattern. A pattern started to emerge. I started to notice that every time I hit something that sounded sad, and it really did sound sad. Like, this kind of curious thing about the tuning forks is that they really do a similar thing to music. So, you know, when we listen to music, like, we all know when we hear sad music, right? Like a minor third is sad. So when you hear sad music and you go, oh, that's sad, is that your intuition telling you that's sad? Or is that really just kind of a feeling, right? It's not really your intuition. It's just kind of like a resonance, right? So that's what I was finding with the tuning forks, is that they'd hit a spot and they'd actually sound sad. And it wasn't intuition, although the male slot definitely helped me to tie it all together. But it was more just like a resonant feeling of sadness. So I started noticing that every time I hit a signal that sounded sad, I was finding it in the left side of the heart center. Every time I hit a signal that sounded frustrated, I was finding it down here. Anytime I hit something that sounded angry, it was out here. So I started to observe that different emotions seem to have different storage bins, you know, or filing drawers, and that every time a particular emotion was felt and the waveform of that particular emotion was generated, that the record of it seemed to go, you know, in this particular space that it belonged in. And not only did I discover that certain zones seem to be specific to certain emotions or specific relationships or specific mental patterns, but that there also seemed to be a timeline aspect to this. And that information I found at the outer edge of the field seemed to relate to a person's gestation and birth. Information that I found close to someone's body seemed to be current or recent. And everything else fell in between, like rings in a tree, and equidistant. So if somebody was 60, I was finding information that was generated when they were 30, about halfway through their field. And so it took a number of years, maybe 4 or so, before this whole sort of what I call the BioField anatomy map really emerged. And not only did I find zones, but I found all different kinds of other random features too, things that I call the hamster wheel of worry, or our personal governor that blocks us from really extending fully through our own will, or heart shields. And there's all kinds of these different structures, but basically what I've done is I've used sonar to map this unseen territory. This territory has been kind of hidden in plain view. And basically what the BioField anatomy hypothesis says is that our memories, rather than being stored in our brain, or maybe in addition to being stored in our brain, appear to be in a biomagnetic bubble around us. It's like our own little personal storage cloud of information. And that everything that we experience passes through the filter of our biofields, of our history. So our biography becomes our biology because it's present all around us and is constantly informing us. And what I found was that when people had had significant traumas that they were unable to digest and release, that there would be a tremendous amount of noise and resistance in their field. And that when people started to get older, especially right around 60 is when it really seems to happen, these pathological oscillations, if you will, start to break down the physiology. And so what I found is that basically every physical pathology has its source in the biofield and is related to some kind of stressful input that we had. And that if we're just treating the body, then we're missing treating where it really is, which is in the biomagnetic field underneath. And that by coming in and finding the traumatic birth, finding the ancestral influences, which are really far more significant than we've been taught to believe. This is one of the things about this work that's been so fascinating, is seeing that babies are not born as clean slates. They come preloaded with all kinds of programs and all kinds of what I call energetic programs, which is the tone of the song of our DNA, that we're really very tonal, and that we've been really programmed to think of everything in terms of chemical, mechanical, and words. But when it comes right down to it, we're collections of vibrations, and everything we think and we feel has a tonal expression. And the tuning forks interact with that, and it's a very pure language. And in doing this research, I found, that every emotion has a specific frequency signature that you can pick up with the tuning fork. Like sadness, like I said, is really obvious. Fear is also really obvious. Fear has a pulsing quality to it. So we know when we get really scared and you start running the frequency of fear through your body, when it gets really big, what happens? You start to shake, right? So that's because that is the frequency pattern of that, and it's animating your physiology. So what I've discovered is that not only do all humans have this common vibrational language, but that plants and animals also have the same language. And the way that I discovered this, we know it's pretty obvious, right? Dogs, horses, they read your vibes. And if anybody's familiar with the work of Cleve Baxter, who wrote The Secret Life of Plants, anybody familiar with that? So what he found, he tells this famous story about how he was trying to get a rise out of plants that he had hooked up to polygraph machines. And he was thinking he was going to cut it and this and that. And then he had the thought, oh, I'm going to go burn it with a match. And all he did was think that thought and have that intention, and the plants went, ah, and it showed up on the polygraph machine, right? The reason why the plant could read that, could sense his intention, is because vibrationally it speaks the same language as humans, and it sensed that. And I've actually seen this with the tuning forks. I've worked on a plant that was afraid once. I was like, this plant is afraid, okay? So, we look at things very differently in this work. Just for example, somebody was mentioning this morning how I talk about somebody who's bipolar, for example. In BioField tuning, we don't really use these kinds of words. We really try to avoid any of that kind of terminology. But what my observation has been about something like someone who's bipolar is that, as reflected by a tuning fork, what we hear in their system is low tones. Like depression, for example, produces this kind of like an undertone, right? Like Eeyore, right? Gray. That's really kind of what it sounds like. Whereas anxiety or nervousness, produces high, fast tones. And so listening to someone who's bipolar, what we hear is all these high, fast, sort of anxious tones. And we hear these low, depressive tones, but they're missing their midtones. So their midtonal expression is not being activated. They're not experiencing themselves from a mid-tone perspective. And, given what we see in our culture, the middle of everything has been kind of taken out, right? I mean, we've really gone into this division and polarity. Even from the perspective of female models, you see skinny models and you see curvy big models, but do you ever see a model my size? I'm medium, I'm a size 6. Right? Have you ever seen a size 6 or size 8 model anywhere? No, right? So even just like medium-sized females are completely unrepresented in the media. You can have your coffee light or your coffee dark, but what if you like it medium, right? What about eggs, runny or hard? But that medium place is where I like my eggs personally. Politics, it's left or right. Where's the center? Who's representing the center or speaking for the center in politics? Even in things like dance hall music, there's a lot of low tones and a lot of high tones, but that whole mid-range, again, is missing. So, it's not surprising that because we are, in many ways products of our inputs, that if all we're getting for inputs is things that are high and fast and things that are low and slow, that we would be missing that middle. And so in BioField tuning, what I found is that sound is really an adaptogen. So if something is running too high and too fast in the system, just bringing a tuning fork into that specific area, okay? Because the work isn't just diagnostic, it's therapeutic. So not only do we find these areas, these histories in people, if I put somebody on a table, I can go through and I could figure out every age where they had a hard time or they got a virus here or a head injury there or personality or mother, because it's all tonally encoded and I figured out how to read it. But it's not just about reading it, it's about finding these areas of distortion and reflecting it back to the body. And then the body hears itself. And when it hears distortion, it's like you have your own little inner piano tuner who uses that pure tone to adjust knobs and dials and relax and release things here and tighten things there. And the body will actually fix itself. It's why lasers work too. You give the body a coherent input to organize itself around, and it'll straighten itself out. It's just an amazing thing. So, I tend to think of what we do in this particular work more as, like we're technicians getting the noise, helping to get the noise out of the signal. Because we're not healing you, you're healing yourself. We're just helping your body to hear itself and then to correct itself, which is an amazing thing that it will do. So this is just an animation that basically explains, this is the sort of basic premise of what's going on. So first of all, the idea is that the biofield is a torus or toroidal shaped structure. And that our memories are stored in standing waves within this field. So those are the standing waves. That is a distortion appearing, a tuning fork coming in and harmonizing it, and then taking the energy that was trapped there and bringing it back into the body. So basically, the idea that this is showing is that when we have these traumatic experiences, that a bit of us goes into freeze in it. When I first started really grasping what was, as I'm combing through the field and I'm hitting these areas of resistance and discovering that, wow, this was a trauma. This was a trauma, and there's some part of you that's still trapped back in that trauma. You know, in shamanism, if any of you are familiar, one of the basic practices of shamanism is called soul retrieval. And in a soul retrieval, a shaman will use their active imagination to journey back in time, where they will find that soul fragment and they'll gather it up. And then they'll bring it into present moment, where they'll either place it or blow it back into the body. And so when I was realizing that these were soul fragments that I was putting back in the body. I was like, this is like sonic soul retrieval, you know? And, you know, you might see a shaman and get one piece brought back, but in these sessions, we're bringing back multiple pieces of people and restoring them back into their wholeness. I've started to think lately about how this is really about activating potential. Because you have all of this electrical potential that is frozen in your field from various kinds of trauma, and it might even be 2, 3, 4 generations back. You know, it isn't even necessarily your own, because we definitely find that. And that when we come into the field, what the tuning fork does is it identifies it, and then it harmonizes it. And when the chaotic waveform that is trapping that energy resolves, the energy that's frozen there decouples, and then the tuning fork is able to act like that magnet and bring that energy back into circulation. So what happens for people when they receive this work? And I can't tell you how many times I've heard these stories. I went home and cleaned out my closets. I busted pockets of clutter that I previously didn't have the energy for. I started writing that book, or that series of books. I slept better, but mostly what I hear is that people suddenly have the energy to get things done that they couldn't before. They didn't have the gumption. They knew it had to be done. And you know, we beat ourselves up for those things, don't we? You know, when you see something needs to be done and you just don't have the energy. And the reason why you don't have the energy is because it's trapped or frozen somewhere in your field. So, you know, there's a distortion trapping energy. The tuning fork comes in, harmonizes the waveform, releases the energy, and brings it back into circulation. So that's the essential premise of what we're doing in BioField Tuning. And it's been helpful with pain, anxiety, depression, vertigo, digestive disorders, PTSD, addiction, panic disorders, phobias, adrenal fatigue, and much more, like all kinds of stuff. What it's been for me, and this is, you know, something that has really, really, really changed my life. I got into the health field 30 years ago. I started reading about human health and potential, science and spirituality, you know, all that stuff when I was 18. And I started because I had become bulimic when I was 17. So back when I was 16, I entered into a beauty pageant, the Miss Teen Connecticut pageant, and I won runner-up and Miss Photogenic. And at the time, I was the size I am now. And I was told by various people, you know, that if it was a field that I wanted to stay in, that I had to lose weight, that I was too fat to be a model or a movie star or a pageant queen. And so at the time, I started reading, you know, things like Cosmopolitan and all of the sort of inputs that teenage women put themselves through. And I became obsessed with my need to weigh 115 pounds. And, you know, I'm pretty big boned, so it wasn't really an option to get that skinny, so I became bulimic. And unfortunately, that just became a sort of vicious cycle because, you know, for any kind of obsessive compulsive disorder, whether it's with food or alcohol or drugs or what have you, you know, it just kind of becomes a vicious cycle that goes nowhere. And it consumes you, and it consumes your mind, it steals your peace. So when I was 18, I tried to stop, and I discovered that I couldn't. And that was very troubling to me. So I started reading self-help books when I was 18. And I read really fast, and I read a lot. I read a lot of self-help books. So by the time I was 20, I had figured out how to stop purging. You know, I figured out two things. One was, in this culture, for young women especially, we have two signs that are held up. One is consume, buy stuff, right? The other is be skinny. Well, I'm a Libra, and I'm what I call a bothist. So I had figured out how to do both. And so I realized that a big part of my disorder was programming. It was cultural programming, that I had been programmed into that kind of behavior. The other thing that I realized was that, well, if it's my hand and my mouth, and I don't have control over it, who does? Where did my self-control go? Who's got it? And how do I get it back? And so I was able to stop the purging, but I wasn't able to stop the binging. And I ballooned up to probably 170 pounds. And it was at a time when I owned a restaurant. I started a restaurant when I was 20, and I was like an alcoholic behind a bar. I was surrounded by food all day, every day. And I mean good food, like, and lots of it. And so I went through, you know, some really epic struggles around all of that, but just kept going back to books and kept going back to books and kept going to seminars and workshops. I did, when I was 21 or 22, I did a 9-day mastery program with Tony Robbins, where I walked across 65 feet of hot coals barefoot, and you know, all kinds of things like that to try to challenge myself and learn and grow. But it took until I was 27 or 28 to finally start to get a handle on my sugar addiction. And what I discovered in the process of trying to get over being addicted to sugar was that I had been using sugar to not feel angry. And I really believed that I was a spiritual person and that I didn't get angry. And my mom had been a very fiery Irish redhead, and when she exploded, it was terrifying, and she threw stuff and like that. I thought that was really poor form. I sure wasn't going to be that way. But what I discovered as I tried to quit sugar was that I had learned to interpret every time I started to get angry as a sugar craving. And so as I tried to give up sugar to get over candida, which I had very badly in my system, I turned into a raging bitch because all of a sudden, all of this anger started to come up. And I had to spend years kind of learning how to process that. But I did. And so as time has gone on, and I've learned more and more, I've been able to heal more and more things. But the really big turning point came in 2010 when I started training training students to do this work. And prior to that, I was trying to get my kids to do it on me. So I have 2 boys, and they were like 6 and 9, 7, 10. And I had really bad chronic mid-back pain, like really bad mid-back pain. And so, you know, I was trying to get them to like put a crystal on my back and run the sound through it and teach them how to do the work. They were like, I just want to get back to my video game. You know, they were not such good practitioners at that time. But when I started getting worked on, it was very exciting. My very first pilot class, my students worked on me, and I remember very specifically this one day when they were working off my left foot. Now I had 7 plantar's warts on my left foot. And the noise that the tuning fork was making was the worst sound I had ever heard on anyone anywhere. I mean, it was like shockingly atonal. And my students were like, Eileen, how can you appear so functional and yet sound so awful? And I said, you know, compartmentalization. I'm really, really good at compartmentalization because I had no choice growing up. Like I wasn't allowed to feel this or do that or get away from this or that. And so I had to learn how to take the parts of me that were hurting, that were wounded, that were unacceptable, and just really kind of file them away and just stay in this sort of like functional part. And so, you know, even just that beginning work on my foot, I got rid of all my Planner's warts. Planner's warts are viruses. They're blind spots of the immune system. But in the BioField anatomy, the left foot is related to, you know, being stuck or mired in a toxic situation or an uncomfortable situation that you can't get out of. And that had been the story of my life. You know, growing up in a family where I was the youngest, in school where I was the youngest, just in one sort of difficult, stressful situation after another after another. And I didn't expect that the tuning was going to help the warts go away, but this happened for numerous clients as well, so it wasn't just me. And then in the years, since 2010, I have been receiving tuning regularly from students, but also a few years ago, when my book came out. So when my book came out in 2014, my practice was already as busy as I could handle. It was full. And now suddenly I was getting requests from around the world where people wanted to see me. And because I had figured out that I could do this work at a distance, suddenly the whole global market had opened up. Now, I didn't believe that it was possible to do this work at a distance. People would always ask me, can you do this at a distance? And I'd be like, no. Like, I'm using sound waves on the body, people. This is physics. No, I don't do it at a distance. I just thought it was really such a silly thing to even consider. But for those of you who've read my book, Dr. Carl Merritt wrote the foreword to it, and he has been a really wonderful mentor to me. He went through my thesis with me page by page. This guy has an incredible overview of energy medicine, the history of it, the major players, and a really incredible resource, and I was so grateful to have ended up with him on my team. But he persuaded me to try a distance session on him. And I was reluctant, and I was skeptical, and I was frustrated that it was even wasting my time to try it, quite frankly. But he lay down on his treatment table in his office in California. He's an MD. And I pretended that he was on my table in Vermont, and I approached the table as if he was really there. And much to my amazement, the same patterns, the same waveform information that shows up when a person is on the table actually showed up when he was not on the table. And I went through and I took notes, and I noted all the ages where things were rough. I noted what organs seemed to be under-functioning. I noted where inflammation appeared to be, and all of these things that I would if somebody was there. And I wrote them all down, and then I got on the phone with him afterwards, and I shared my notes, and he said, Eileen, all of those things are exactly right. And I experienced a state change while you were working on me. And I was like, wow, that's pretty wild. And so after that, I started experimenting with distance sessions. And in the beginning, I did it without an open line of communication. And what it forced me to do when I didn't have a body there to ask questions, what happened when you were 10? Did you have an accident when you were 15? I didn't have anybody to give me feedback. And so I had to listen even more deeply into the information I was encountering. And it came to me that it was really like binary, that it was all just like ones and zeros. It was really very much math, and that what I was doing was very much physics. So that even though this practice that seemed so incredibly woo-woo, tuning for healing of your energy field at a distance, I mean, what gets more woo-woo than that, right? That is actually very pure science. And it's really, it's really interesting. And it forced me to get to understand the language even more. Which ended up becoming, a real benefit. And it's just seeing more deeply into what was there. So when my practice got super busy and started to become unmanageable, one of the things that I noticed was that a great many of my clients were women baby boomers. Raise your hand if you're a women baby boomer. Okay. A lot of those out there who are looking for help. And what I was discovering was that they all seemed to have this similar pattern. And the pattern that I observed was that they had a lousy birth. They might have been pulled out with forceps. Mom was drugged. The birth itself was pretty traumatic. Then they were bottle-fed on a schedule. Bottle-fed on a schedule, not breastfed on demand. You don't want to spoil the baby by giving it what it needs, apparently. So they were bottle-fed muck, on a schedule. They didn't get skin-to-skin contact. And so what I found in their BioField anatomy was that in their left knee, because they had never really experienced satiation, feeling of like desire, satiation, release, that's the natural cycle, with a baby wanting to be fed or wanting to be held. They were in a kind of constant state of anxiety and need, and not very good at, knowing when it was time to end a relationship or end a job, not necessarily trusting that their needs were going to get met. So they had a tendency to stay in things longer than they should. Then they had this terrible experience of frustration over unmet needs, which is the second and first and second chakras, where there's sort of just this chronic, ongoing frustration over unmet needs that often resulted in digestive upset, like a tendency towards stomach aches in childhood, and then in adulthood, just not being able to digest dairy or wheat, or just all kinds of like weak digestive issues. There's a tremendous amount of sadness because mom was kind of, and honestly, after World War II, like people had PTSD. Everybody was kind of like not present, and there was a lot of boozing and a lot of smoking, going on, and people weren't emotionally present after World War II because of so many people's lives were touched. So, mom was kind of like emotionally distant, and maybe dad too. Because there was this feeding on a schedule, there was all of this crying and not being responded to. So there was a belief that my needs aren't important. It doesn't matter what I say, I'm not going to be heard or responded to. And that had continued up until present day. And then because there was this belief that their needs weren't important, they actually had spent their whole life taking care of everybody else. And what happens to women when the kids leave and there's this sudden desire to have it be about you. But what happens when we live in these particular patterns is that they actually create a kind of mass in our field. So if we've been continually blocked moving forward and our biofield is filled with areas of resistance all along the area of our right knee, right? Even when that being blocked goes away, because it's a habit, we're going to self-sabotage, we're going to create our own obstacles. And so we actually become energetically hemmed in by these patterns that we've lived a lifetime with. And it becomes very difficult to change. And a lot of New Age information says, change your thinking, change your life. So you try to do that, but you still keep defaulting to the same behavior. And then what happens? You feel guilty because you're failing, right? Everybody relate to that. It's like, now I'm going to be in judgment of myself because I'm trying to change my thinking and change my life, but it's not working. And the reason it's not working is because energy flows along established pathways. And in order to change our life, we don't just have to change our thinking, we have to change our feeling. To change the way we feel and the record, in a way, of the way that we feel. We've got to make the changes happen in the magnetic field. This is primary. This is the most important part. And if we're not, this is that 95% of you that's subconscious. This is a way to access that and to actually work on it and change the way energy flows there. So because there were so many of these people who had this particular issue, I decided to do an experiment and work on them in a group. And so I came up with, if you're a baby boomer woman and you have these particular symptoms, I'm going to do a free session for you. Well, within 3 days, 145 people signed up, and I don't even know where they came from. It was just like, yes, I'm in. And so that very first one that I did, we didn't have a live connection. It was just connect by intention. And so it did it, and my assistant Jillian was in the room with me. And at one point, when I got to the heart, it got so hot in the room, all these energy bodies. But when I made the adjustment in the heart, because prior to that, it felt like I was working on a whole bunch of different people. When I made the adjustment in the heart, it suddenly, like this big whoosh came through the room, and everything changed and synchronized. And so it was a Facebook event, and so after it ended, people were logging into the Facebook page, and they were saying what their experience was. And person after person after person said, at the 45-minute mark or so, I felt this big whoosh and really experienced a state change. So that was really amazing to me, that I was able to work on a group. And so I did a few more free experiments and sent out monkey surveys, and people were like, I felt it, I heard it, I sensed it, I feel different. And I was like, wow, well, this is efficient. So I changed my model, and I started working on groups, which is what I do now. I'm actually working on some this month. I'm doing one on women's bodies, which was interesting. And I'm doing one on upper back and shoulders, and I'm doing one on clarity and coherence. But over the years, I've done more than 200 of these, and I've put myself, my own hologram, in every single one. And this practice of working on myself and everybody else as well has really, really changed things. And my whole system has changed as a consequence of doing this work. I feel lighter. I mean, I feel so light, but I feel strong. I feel grounded. I'm able to work, lately, the last few months, I've really had to work 7 days a week. I've taught, this year, I taught 33 classes in 6 countries, 4 continents, and these are like 3 to 5 day classes, often back to back on opposite coasts. I went to Australia and came back, I went to England and came back, and what I've learned from this practice, I don't get jet lag. In fact, I can't even remember the last time I felt tired, like that kind of like dragging feeling. My energy always stays up, it stays high, and I've learned how to adjust to every environment that I go into in order to keep that. And this is all like a kind of energetic intelligence that's been imparted to me through basically having my biofield groomed a whole lot and having the resistance, the drag, and the noise taken out of it. So these are just some of the things that I've been able to heal. I want to talk just a little bit about cosmology. In the process of discovering this practice and developing it, it really raised a tremendous amount of questions for me. For example, when I hit resistance in the field, it felt to me like it really had mass, like it had substance, like it was stuff, right? And so I'm hitting this stuff with my tuning fork and moving this stuff, and I'm going, well, what is this stuff? What is it, And I was trying to find physicists to talk to about it, So I'd send these people an email, I'm like, hi, I'm a sound healer in Vermont, and I'm using tuning forks in people's energy fields, and I'm encountering stuff that I can move, and I need help figuring out what it is. And they're like, Actually, Carl Merritt was the first person that I found who would actually talk to me. And when I talked to him on the phone and explained it all to him, and he spoke it back to me, what I was doing, I practically fell over with joy that some intelligent person was actually able to give me some valuable feedback about my own sensed phenomenon. Why does this stuff appear to have charge and resistance? What's making that happen? What law of physics governs the fact that I can use a tuning fork like a magnet? Is sound magnetic? Do you know how many times I typed that into Google? Sound magnetic? And I couldn't find anything, not a single scientific resource at all. I'd find references to music, people would be like, oh, the music down the alley was magnetically drawing us there, kind of thing. But nothing about the actual science of it. I read somewhere that bees' wings create an electromagnetic charge. I'm like, okay, well, that's not really so different, is it, than a vibrating tuning fork? It's vibration. But then, actually, last March, I did finally come across a scientific study that said science had determined that sound in a particular frequency range produces a magnetic charge. And that was a real relief to find that. Now, what's interesting about a tuning fork is a tuning fork produces technically an infinite number of overtones and undertones as well. Now, when you strike a tuning fork and activate it, you're hearing all of what's in the audible range, which is about 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz, but it's producing all these other frequencies that are much higher and much lower. It's just, we make these aluminum tuning forks that are designed especially to make these overtones. And it's the overtones and undertones that sort of bend and morph, when they encounter the standing waves in the field. It's that waveform intersection that information is coming through. So we're using sound in the inaudible range and also in the range where science has determined that there is magnetic charge. So that was great to be able to be like, okay, yes, this is a magnetic interaction that's going on here. Is it possible that I've discovered a territory that no one has mapped yet? You know, this was my biggest problem when I was doing this work and I was discovering all of this, because I could not find anywhere in any literature any correlation, anybody saying that memories are stored in the field and that memories are stored in these specific regions in the field. And I was like, you know what, I'm like a restaurant owner and a popcorn popper. Like, what am I doing discovering something that nobody's discovered before? Like, I had a really hard time wrapping my head around that, and I really doubted it. I really doubted the veracity of my findings. I really questioned it. And even when I started teaching my first group of students, I was very reluctant to teach them the BioField anatomy map, because I was like, you know what, guys, this is one person's subjective experience, and I'm reluctant to teach it to you. And my students were like, you know, Eileen, it doesn't matter whether it exists or not. The fact of the matter is that it's a system that works. Because you can take a 3-day class with me and go home, and on your very first practice body, you can tell them the ages that they've had major traumas, right? Who's done that of my students? Yeah. You're just working off that map, you find these things, and that has replicated itself thousands of times. Thousands of times, people have used this map, and they've used it to successfully identify the stories of people's lives. Does it exist objectively? I don't know, okay? I don't know. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a moment. I wanted to know if there was a way to objectively determine if my observations were actually there. So in the process of trying to answer these questions, I actually discovered a whole new cosmology. And that was not what I was expecting. But when I discovered this cosmology, and it really began to unfold in its truth before me, I realized that I had found what I had been looking for in all of those years of devouring self-help books, where I never, ever really found the answers I was looking for. I always had a kind of chronic low-level sadness, a kind of background depression and angst that would never really go away. And what I discovered was that, for me anyway, and I think for a lot of people, that the problem wasn't what was wrong with me, but rather the problem was our cosmological story. Our cosmological story. Okay, so what is cosmology? Cosmology is the kind of overarching big picture way that we describe life, the universe, and everything. So there's religious cosmology, you know, in the beginning was the Word, right? And God said, let there be light. Creationism, that's a cosmology. Big Bang is our current cosmology. Okay? And Big Bang basically says, in the beginning was nothing, which was infinitely hot and infinitely dense, nothingness, which for no reason exploded, for no particular reason. And it turned into the visible universe. And in the beginning, there was a very high degree of order, for no particular reason. But ever since then, it has been spreading out and diffusing, and is going to keep on until it basically like dies this sort of dissipative heat death. And that, you know, life is random, it's chaotic, it's meaningless, it's cold, it's isolated, right? Sound is an empty vacuum, and sound doesn't travel through space, so nobody can hear you scream. You know, you're all alone here. And we're often some insignificant part of the Milky Way galaxy. And that there's black holes in the middle of galaxies that are devouring light, and mysterious dark energy and dark matter lurking about. And basically, this cosmological story is incredibly grim. First of all, it doesn't make any sense at all. It's highly illogical, right? And it's depressing, and it's dark, and it's all about separation. So we're walking around informed by this illogical, depressing cosmological story without having any idea how much it's informing us. There's another piece of the story in there, whether you were raised Christian or not, that we're also guilty sinners that have fallen from grace, and that we should feel guilty because we're sinners. So we've got that programmed very deeply into us as well, all right? So what I discovered, this happened one day. My son Quinn came to the table at dinner, and he said to me, "Did you know there's a fourth state of matter called plasma?" And I was like, solid, liquid, gas. No, somehow I missed an entire state of matter. How did that happen? And he explained it a little bit. And then in the same conversation, we were talking about space and whether it was a vacuum or not. And my husband was like, well, of course it's a vacuum, right? That's what we're told. It's like this empty vacuum of nothingness. And I was like, no, I read somewhere once that there's actually something out there. And so I went and I Googled, space is not a vacuum. And what came up was plasma. I was like, plasma, how interesting. And basically, I went down the plasma rabbit hole. And over the next 4 months, I started reading everything I possibly could about plasma. And it completely changed my life. This is just the happiest discovery that I've ever made. And so we're going to talk about plasma. But before we get to plasma, we have to talk about ether. Okay, we're going to talk about ether, and then we're going to take a break. So well, there's too many of my students in here to ask this question. Most of you know about ether. But I want to know, why does nobody believe in ether? Where did ether go? Okay? Because ether was part of the standard cosmology up until Einstein came along. And then there's this, so most people, what the standard model story says about ether is that the concept of it was allegedly disproven by what's called the Michelson-Morley experiment in the late 1800s. And as far as they're concerned, this experiment, which was actually conducted repeatedly afterwards much better and showed different outcomes. But this, if you go to Wikipedia, it'll say that, the notion of the ether was disproved by this experiment, and there's no such thing as ether. And actually, electromagnetic waves don't need a medium to propagate in. They can propagate through a vacuum, okay? So the whole concept of the ether was taken out of cosmology at the same time that Nikola Tesla was taken out, okay? So who's never heard of Nikola Tesla? Okay, just a couple of you. Okay, Nikola Tesla was an extraordinary scientist. He was a contemporary of Edison's. And he was actually a far superior scientist in every way than Edison was. And he's, for those of you who've never heard of him, is worthy of a quick Google, just so that you can this is him, this handsome devil. He didn't dig chicks, though. So this is what he says. All perceptible matter comes from a primary substance or tenuity beyond conception, filling all space, the akasha or luminiferous ether, which is acted upon by the life-giving prana or creative force, calling into existence in never-ending cycles all things and phenomena. The primary substance, thrown into infinitesimal whirls of prodigious velocity, becomes gross matter. The force subsiding, the motion ceases, and matter disappears, reverting to the primary substance. Okay? So basically what ether is it's the substrata. It's the luminiferous ocean that electromagnetic waves travel through. Light waves travel through the ether. It's the ground state of all of explicate reality. And it is the medium that polarizes to become the positive and negative charges of electricity. Okay? Ether polarizes into this. And ether precipitates down into the other states of matter. It spins itself, as he's saying, that it whirls into, and everything is just basically light. It's basically the ether that has spun itself into what appears to be matter, but is really just condensed light. Okay? Now, Tesla wanted to harness free energy from the ether and broadcast it free to all people. Okay? Why do we think that ether and Tesla came out of, history books, science books? It's economics. Okay? Another reason that's cited for the removal of ether from our education has to do with the national security. Okay? So we can't talk about electricity in any kind of real way without first acknowledging the existence of the ether, because the ether is the ground state that electricity comes from and that moves through. It's also, we could call it, if you've ever heard of the Akashic record, because the ether is all one thing, it's all just one big ocean of oneness, anything that's going on here it knows, right? It knows that this planet is spinning that way and this planet is spinning that way. It's all instantaneous. It knows if I'm waving a tuning fork over your hologram here and you're in California, because it's all happening in the same one medium. And it's resonance within the ether that allows, for example, distance healing to occur. Now, we're trying to get at this when we talk about things like quantum entanglement, okay? But the trouble with trying to apply quantum languaging to things like distance healing is that when they talk about quantum, they're still missing the ether. They're still missing the unifying substrata. And so it doesn't really answer the question. And to me, if we just put the ether back in the cosmology, it answers all of these questions of why distance healing works, why remote viewing works, why you get that feeling, that somebody's about to call you, right? And then they do. So it's just resonance through the ether. It's a very simple, logical, easy explanation to just put this back in and to understand why it was taken out in the first place. I mean, another kind of belief that people hold is that it was taken out to support Einstein's theory of relativity, and that Einstein didn't support the concept of the ether. But I have a quote in my book where Einstein later said, "Space without ether is unthinkable."